que veamos en la regulación y en la legislación en materia de competencia económica algo sencillo y a que tengamos una perspectiva amplia de los grandes temas que nos permitan tomar decisiones con confianza. El comisionado presidente del IFT nos ha invitado a reflexionar en varias ocasiones sobre el papel que han de jugar los reguladores de telecomunicaciones y autoridades de competencia en un contexto de acelerados cambios tecnológicos. Para poner en contexto el seminario de hoy, me gustaría comentar que ya en la reunión ministerial de la OCDE en 2016 en Cancún, se destacó la importancia de aprovechar las oportunidades que suscitan las aplicaciones y tecnologías emergentes, de promocionar la gestión de riesgo de seguridad digital y la protección de privacidad al más alto nivel y de aprovechar en mayor medida las oportunidades derivadas de las plataformas en línea. El día de hoy tendremos la oportunidad de escuchar una presentación y discutirla sobre la perspectiva europea en materia de regulación de la economía de datos. Como todos sabemos, la Unión Europea es uno de los referentes más interesantes en cuanto al establecimiento de reglas y políticas públicas que apuntan hacia facilitar la transformación digital. Particularmente en 2015, la Unión Europea estableció la Estrategia sobre el Mercado Único Digital, que busca poner a esta región como líder mundial en la economía digital. El principal foco de la estrategia europea han sido las nuevas reglas sobre protección de datos y privacidad en las comunicaciones electrónicas que entraron en vigor recientemente con un estándar realmente ambicioso. En suma, la idea de este ejercicio es contribuir a las decisiones que debemos comenzar a tomar en el instituto sobre los temas de futuro y hacer conciencia del impacto positivo que tendrá nuestro trabajo si entendemos de mejor manera el contexto que nos rodea. Para enfrentar este reto, permítanme presentar primero a Michelle Ledger. Michelle dirige el Servicio de Inteligencia sobre Medios y Regulación de Collin International. También trabaja temas de economía digital y tiene un amplio conocimiento sobre la instrumentación de regulación a nivel nacional en toda Europa. Es profesora asistente de Derecho Comparado en la Universidad de Namur en Bélgica y se unió a Collin International en 1998. Por su parte, Philippe Dufresne es director fundador de Collin International, es economista y ha estado los últimos 25 años analizando la regulación de las telecomunicaciones y la evolución del mercado. Como a todos nos consta, es un muy activo conferencista internacional que antes de fundar Collin y dedicarse a asesorar a reguladores y operadores en 50 países, trabajó para la Comisión Europea. Estimados colegas, muchas gracias por acompañarnos. Gracias, como siempre, a la Unidad de Administración por su apoyo en la organización de este seminario. Estarán los micrófonos abiertos para que realicen comentarios o preguntas. Y si bien el seminario va a desarrollarse en inglés, tengan la confianza de expresarse en español y por acá nosotros ayudamos en la interpretación de sus comentarios. Cedo la palabra a Philippe Dufresne. Bienvenidos, muchas gracias.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Juan Carlos, for this kind introduction. Some of you may have seen me last year talking about net neutrality. Net neutrality, we discussed it again with some of you. That's a very narrow topic. You know, you can really go into every detail, and after an hour, you know, you get a good feel for the topic. The topic that we've got on our plate for this seminar, the regulation of the data economy. Juan Carlos said digital economy. I don't know why people increasingly say data economy. Why? Because the issue of protecting the data, the issue of securing the data, the issue of accessing the data becomes really on the forefront. I don't know, the vocabulary is changing. If you want to be trendy these days, you don't say digital economy, you say data economy. It seems to be more well, it reflects on a new emphasis on data. This is, as you will see over the next couple of hours, the regulation of the data economy is a really broad topic. And we're not planning to turn you into instant expert of data regulation, but more modestly, we will try to give you an overview of all the different topics that fall into this topic. And to get the ball rolling, some of you may, if I show you that, how do you, Aldo, data is the new what? Those, nobody, no, the new currency. Data, yeah, that's a good one. That's absolutely a good one. Data is the new gold, or the economists say data is the new oil, you know. Alors, it's a good expression, new oil, because, you know, the oil is what has fueled, you know, the economy throughout the 20th century. For any activity, somewhere there was oil behind. It's, of course, a misleading metaphor, because oil is there is a limited quantity of oil around the world. There seem to be more left than we thought a few years ago, but it's not a replicable good. Data is potentially a resource that can be replicated. So the potential of data is potentially vaster than the potential of... But what we mean by the data economy, it's a large range of various activities. I'll just take two examples. The first one is really stupid. This is a vacuum cleaner, you know, an automatic vacuum cleaner. It's made by a company called iRobots, but there are many brands doing that. And you may say, Philip, you know, where is the data? It's just a vacuum cleaner. Perhaps some of you, you know, have some. My neighbor has that to cut the grass back home. But what is interesting is that I was reading an interview of the CEO of iRobots, the company doing that. And although the product is on the market, they're now putting their minds on how they could generate additional revenues by monetizing the data generated by the vacuum cleaner. You may say, Philip, what data can the vacuum cleaner generate? For example, you buy such a thing, you put it in your apartment. After a few weeks, he can basically know all the dimension of your department, you know. He can produce a blueprint, you know, a map of your apartment. Potentially sell it to a company selling furnitures, you know, tables, chairs, sofa, and so on. And instead of just sending you stupidly a catalog with table and chairs and sofas, can basically send you an offer that is tailor-made to your apartment. You know? Another application that they are thinking about is spotting the rooms in your apartment, in your house, where there is not a good Wi-Fi coverage. To basically, and then again, resell the data to a company selling Wi-Fi repeaters, or so that, you know. Another one is interaction between your vacuum cleaner and your home assistant to switch off the lights in the rooms where you are not. You know? So that's just an example. So the purpose of me showing you this vacuum cleaner, it proves that whatever, you can be in the most stupid business on earth, you know, vacuum cleaner, it's no longer just a vacuum cleaner. You think as a company, which data can I collect and how can I monetize those data, you know? Who watched this? You know? No. Rebecca denies it. No, Philip, I was reading a book on economics that Saturday. No, I know, basically, you know, one of the commercial TV channel, the biggest TV channel in the UK, commercial TV channel in the UK, was using artificial intelligence for face recognition. Face recognition is one of the big, you know, application for artificial intelligence. So that's another way, if you like, of using data. You know, using a royal wedding. I mean, no, behind there is a lot of data economy now. Now, whether this is a quote from a recent European Commission document, and you don't have to read it all, but it's really it's very pink. You know, it said, artificial intelligence, data economy, this is great. It means prosperity, better government, better healthcare, better everything. You know, so there is a very, very positive message from governments, I don't know, probably in Mexico as well, behind, you know, all these new technologies. Of course, when you discuss that with your neighbor, your friends, you know, on Friday night over a mezcal, maybe some of your friends are less enthusiastic that the government say, you know, Aldo, do you think I still have my job? I'm a banker. You know, do you think I'll still have my job in 5 years because maybe Google will do it for me? Alors, new technology does not necessarily mean, you know, bad news for workers. This is a stupid analogy. It's the number of ATM, you know, the cash machine. ATM that started to spread out in the US throughout the 80s. And the blue line shows you the number of bank employees that US Bank recruited during that same period. I mean, if you see this, you say, Philip, if artificial intelligence is going to be like ATM for banking, we don't have to worry about it. Huh? Now, of course, in the past, the kind of activities that IT system did that replaced humans, like distributing cash, or you look at what you do every day with your Excel, it's basically something relatively simple. Whatever your Excel does, you could do it with a paper and a pencil. Huh? It just does it fastly. The big difference with artificial intelligence is that computers are going to replace human beings for much more sophisticated tasks, you know, such as recognizing pictures, such as medical diagnosis, such as lawyers pouring through thousands of pages of, you know, of files of 1,000 pages to look for smoke guns, and really sophisticated tasks that in the past were only the monopoly of human beings. This will be done by artificial intelligence systems. So when you hear that, all of a sudden, your friends, your neighbor, perhaps a bit ourselves, we start wondering, will we have a job, you know, 5 years from now? And if we ask experts, you know, Pew, you know, this very good research center in the US called Pew, interviewed 2,000 economists that sort of look at this field of this space of technology and employment. And they ended up 50-50 optimistic and 50% pessimistic. So even the economists that sort of they have decided to specialize their career on the dialogue between technology and the job market are divided. And when Pew asks itself, why is it that these clever economists cannot agree on whether it's a good or bad for employment, artificial intelligence, one reason is the technology is still new. We don't know exactly what's going to happen. We don't know the reaction of consumers. Will you buy a vacuum cleaner with, you know, a data connection quickly or not, and so on. But I want to put the emphasis on the last bullet point that I've got put on the slide here. The public acceptance, you know, whether Mexican citizens, consumers are going to, Mexican companies, corporations, and the government itself, whether they are going to adopt artificial intelligence fastly or rather take a back seat and see how it's going around the world will depend to a large extent about the regulation, about the rules, the democratic rules that we will put around that technology. So regulation, data economy, it's not about red tape, you know, it's not about knowing Google. Okay, it would be fine if Mexican and Europeans could get a bit of tax money from Google. We all agree on that. But this is not the main thing. You know, the main thing is really to understand the new challenges raised by the data economy and basically protect our citizens, our corporation, just like, you know, our government, parliament have been doing for other things for decades now. So that's my last slide before I pass to Michel, and I'll come back in a minute later. But so really, this talk this morning is about the regulation of what? It's about the regulation of the following thing. We see mobile phones. We see when you do web browsing for shopping. We see IoTs with all the development of sensors. All that is the data collection. You know, there are many more ways these days, many more opportunities for companies, for government to collect data. The data is then carried, stored in the clouds, and then it's being processed by all these acronyms that we read in newspapers every day: machine learning, artificial intelligence, blockchain, and all these things. And finally, you know, there are automated processes that creates consequences for citizens, okay? So our purpose is to look at these various elements, if you like, of the value chain from data collection to storage processing to basically consequences for citizens. Okay.
So, thank you, Philippe. That was the first part of this session. So what I'm going to focus on, because I'm a lawyer, so we have a completely different way of looking at things. So I think it's very interesting for you to have the combination of our skills and knowledges. So I'm going to share with you how in the European Union we approach this issue of regulating new players and new services mainly. So the initial part of my presentation will be slightly academic in the sense that I'm going to explain to you the various types of operators and services that we regulate. And I'm going to share with you the way the wind is blowing and which way policymakers in Europe are trying to capture these new services. And take it or leave it from us, nothing is ideal. There are flaws in what we're doing. I just want to share with you what we're doing so that you can learn from the European experience. So these are, of course, all the types of new services, new players that you can imagine, and they're mostly, first of all, global operators, of course. So, can you not? Yeah, okay. I'll put the microphone a bit closer to me. So, of course, you know, how on earth do you regulate all these types of services? That's the question that all policymakers ask themselves, that all regulators that you are also have to ask yourselves. So I'm going to share with you how we do it in Europe, and I'm sure some of it is very similar, at least initially, to what you do. So first of all, the treatment of digital services. What we do is we very much regulate types of services. Of course, we don't regulate operators. Operators per se, a telecom operator can be providing different types of services, of course. So the question is, in Europe, what type of service does the operator provide? Okay, so these are the main categories of services that we have in the European Union, and they're regulated in a very different manner, often also by different regulators, and sometimes, as you'll see, by nobody at all. So my big question is there somehow a no man's land that needs to be somehow maybe captured by a regulator or by a specific policy instrument, maybe a horizontal policy instrument instead of a sector-specific instrument, okay? So the different types of services are electronic communication services. These are your traditional telecom services. We have audiovisual media services, television services, okay? We have a very, very strange category of service that I'm not sure you have here in Mexico, which is that of an information society service. And I'll come back to the definition so that you can understand precisely what these services are, and more importantly, what type of rules apply to these services and who regulate them, okay? Then, of course, you can have payment services and just services per se, you know, covering the general horizontal legislation. So I'm just going to share with you, don't go to sleep, because after what I'm going to do is we're going to try to qualify some of these services under EU legislation so that you can completely understand the scope of application of this sector-specific regulation and therefore see what the role of regulators is in relation to these services, okay? And you'll see that perhaps there are loopholes, okay? So an electronic communication service, I'm sure, is very similar to the definition that you have, is a service that consists wholly or mainly in the conveyance of signals, okay? An audiovisual service, you have to have some sort of editorial responsibility, and we're talking about moving pictures, okay, with or without sound. And you regulate who? You regulate the person that has editorial responsibility. And in Europe, we have a very specific system in that we regulate both linear television services, but also Netflix-type services, on-demand services, okay? So the idea is that you have editorial responsibility because you determine precisely what programs people are going to be seeing in a television channel, or you decide which films people are going to see in an online video service, okay? And then we've got this strange concept of an information society service. And that's basically a sort of fallback definition. And as you'll see, it covers many, many types of services. It's a service provided at a distance by electronic means and on individual request of a recipient of a service. So it's a very wide definition, okay? So those are the main categories of services that we have in Europe and that will, in fact, be very relevant to all this data economy sector at large, okay? Now, we're going to play a little game, and I want you to identify for me the type of service that we are talking about, okay, on the basis of the definitions that I've just given you. I'm sorry, I'm a bit like a university professor here. I don't want to sound pedantic, and you're not students at all. Eh? I'm just trying to make it clear for you so that we all move on the same wavelength. Especially you understand, what the consequences are. I hope everybody can understand my English as well. I'm not talking too quickly. So. Your turn. Let's start with one. Netflix. Audiovisual, yes. What's this? WhatsApp? Oh, yeah. Yes, well, I can see there's a bit of a distinction here between some that consider it as an electronic communication service and others that say clearly more an information society service. Well, I mean, I must say that it's more considered as an information society service because they don't actually convey the signal, you see, so they're not really an electronic communication service. They don't operate the network. So, yes, at the moment, yes, a WhatsApp-type service is more like an information society service. And then we've got LinkedIn, Dropbox. Yeah. YouTube? Ooh. You say they've got editorial responsibility, do you? No. They don't, not normally, no. No. So normally information society service. Facebook, same. Okay, so I think you've got Skype. I think you've got my point. You've got my point. The majority of these new services are qualified as information society services. Now, bear with me for the consequence of all that. And this is why the regulation in Europe is evolving as well, okay? So this is the status quo as we speak, okay? Things are changing precisely to make sure that some of these services could fall within the scope of pieces of legislation, okay? I'm not going to talk about Uber. Now, the consequence of all this is that our Netflix-type services, our television services, it's going to be revised very, very soon, and I'll tell you a little bit what's going to happen with that. The telecom rules, the telecom service is obviously regulated, just like in your countries, by the telecom regulation, telecom directives, dates from 2009, and those rules are also about to be revised. Okay, so we've got the two blocks of legislation, audiovisual and telecom, which are about to be revised, and the rest. Our information society services are regulated under the e-commerce directive. And that e-commerce directive was adopted in 2000, okay, years ago, well before Facebook and, all the YouTubes and everything. And so most of it is regulated like that. Now, what does that mean in terms of the consequences? And that's where it's very interesting. From my point of view, Philippe might go to sleep at this stage and think, how boring can you get? But no, it's very interesting. It's very interesting because the Audiovisual Media Services Directive regulates these television services and on-demand services to protect viewers, to promote certain public policy objectives, to protect minors very much, okay? So basically to protect people and to make sure that we're watching what we should be watching, okay? The objectives of competition, of telecom regulation, I don't need to explain what that is, but it's basically to do with ensuring competition on the market, consumer welfare, investment into infrastructures, okay? And the objective of the Electronic Commerce Directive at the time of adoption of that directive was to make sure that these services, electronic commerce, could happen on the internet, okay? Just transaction, basically. And there's a very, very light touch regime, okay, that only has a very few obligations. And these are mainly to do with saying who you are as a company, making sure that there's a few rules on advertising, but very little, nothing on the protection of minors, no public policy objectives, very, very, very clear, apart from making sure that services develop on the internet and the internet enables electronic commerce, as we said at the time. Okay? Now, the consequences are huge of these different regulatory regimes. If I start by the telecom sector, of course, we have a system whereby a telecom operator who wants to operate a service is required to either have a license or a general authorization. The same goes for the media types of services, audiovisual media services. You need a license, you need to comply with a number of rules, you're checked, etc., etc. But in relation to the information society services, the directive says free access. Anybody can set up a website, anybody can set up an online service, and you cannot have an authorization system, okay? So the consequence, again, there are many other differences that I'm not going to go into today in terms of the different regulatory scenarios, but basically it means this is of interest for you, I think, in terms of the regulatory oversight of these services. It's very different. When you look at telecom services, we're here with big, independent, powerful regulators. If we think in many countries, I mean, here you're lucky you're a converged regulator, but in many countries you have a media regulator that regulates the television services and the Netflix type services, and they're not necessarily independent, well-funded, etc., etc. So you have regulators. It is a regulated sector, okay? But for these information society services, the big question is, where's it gone? The big question is, it's gone. Is it a no man's land? Okay, so no, it's okay, Philippe. So is it a no man's land? Who is regulating? Should somebody be regulating these online services? That's the question. I mean, that's the question. Well, let me bring to you just a few thoughts that I have about that, not in terms of what should happen. That I'm not. I don't have a solution. I'm not comfortable to tell you what should be the solution, but I can at least tell you what's happening in Europe in relation to these online services that are not regulated by a particular regulator. Sorry. So basically, I was going to start by saying that we have in Europe very strong data protection authorities. And these, of course, these data protection authorities are charged with making sure that the personal data that operators in general, companies in general, here they are, that companies in general comply with rules on the protection of personal data. Now, I'm going to come back to that a little bit later, but you can be sure, at least in Europe, that the roles of data protection authorities is going to be on the increase, certainly, and they're going to become very powerful regulators. We have, of course, competition authorities that could, of course, regulate or impose obligations on companies that are dominant or that don't comply with the competition rules. We have ministries as well in some countries that are pretty active, especially in relation to the protection of consumers in general. Okay? Then we have the telecom regulators, who in some countries have a desire, at least, to regulate a little bit more widely than the pure telecom sector. And this is particularly the case in Europe if you think of topics like fighting online piracy, promoting media literacy. There's a number of areas where telecom regulators are stepping into the digital economy sector slowly, but I can't say there's a trend. I'm just saying it happens in a few selected areas, okay? And then we have sometimes specific national authorities that can be set up, especially in the field of data security, say, for the security agencies. That's a typical example. Or specific authorities to fight child pornography and topics like that, okay? And then we have a growing influence, I think, in Europe of what we call consumer protection associations who can bring cases on behalf of consumers if there are problems, especially before the courts. Okay, so this is not a no man's land in terms of what regulators, you know, of who should do what, you know. It's a bit of a crowded space, and it depends very much on the areas that we're looking at, because of course, you know, there's different types of legislations that could apply. So I just wanted to share with you just in a few minutes the way the wind is blowing in Europe on how these new OTTs, over-the-top services, are being regulated, will become regulated. And we have what we call the communication OTTs, like these. Next time I'm not putting any animations in any slides at all. Okay, it's okay. We're a bit far maybe from the connection. Anyway, so we've got the communication OTTs and we've got what we call the content OTTs, which are typically people like YouTube. And so the way the wind is blowing is like this. We have new legislation in the pipeline to say that the Audiovisual Media Services Directive is about to be revised. So we have a political agreement since, in fact, the day before yesterday, on a new rules that will govern the audiovisual sector. The rules will be extended to cover video sharing platforms, so platforms, operators that have no editorial responsibility, but because they organize the way in which the content is made available, content that's user-generated or that's put on the platform by regulated operators like television channels, because they do that, they have a specific role, okay? And the role is to protect minors and to protect the general public against incitement to hatred, so hate speech and terrorist-type content, and also rules on advertising. So the scope of this piece of legislation is extending to capture these new players, but still is to do with them providing audio-visual content, okay? So normal Facebook activity when we chat, etc., would not be regulated under this Audiovisual Media Services Directive. It's only to the extent that there's audiovisual content on it, okay? So that's one sort of movement that you can see. The second movement is these communication OTTs, which will become slightly, well, will be captured now in the new telecom rules at EU level, in the new European Electronic Communications Code that will be adopted. That new code as well, there was a political agreement just a few days ago, and at least for the revision of the Audiovisual Media Services Directive, the new rules will enter into force only in 2020. It takes forever, you know, for member states then to implement the rules, etc. And it's the same sort of time frame for the new telecom rules. But basically, it means that Skype-type services and WhatsApp-type services will be regulated, but not, don't get overexcited. It's only in certain very targeted areas, like security, like the protection of confidentiality of communications. It's very, very limited, okay? But still, there is, a movement to bring these communication services into the remit of the telecom regulators. Okay? Not lost you? Good. So, now I'm just going to give you a quick intro into data protection rules, okay? So we have, this is covering European level regulatory developments, believe you me, is a full-time job for many, many analysts working for Cullen International and in general. There is so many new developments that happen all the time. Now, you've probably all heard of the GDPR. Yeah? Okay. So this is our new General Data Protection Regulation that entered into force, do you know when? Yeah, you're very well informed. May the 25th, 2018. So we have a new block of legislation which is common to the 28 member states in Europe now on data protection, okay? And this data protection regulation covers all the services that you can imagine, every single type of service, because it's a so-called horizontal piece of legislation. Okay, so, and then we have a specificity that I'm not going to dwell upon, but we have a specific e-privacy directive, which is about to be revised and transformed into an e-privacy regulation, and that regulation only covers the electronic communication sector at large, meaning also the new communication OTTs. And that's to do with the protection of the confidentiality of the communications and the protection of personal data that goes onto our devices, so the tracking of our devices. So basically, what you need to remember is that I'm talking now mainly about the General Data Protection Regulation, because that's the one that's it's the general piece of legislation that applies to all sectors, including the telecom sector. Okay, the telecom sector has a few sector-specific rules on top, but basically this is it. And any personal data that's processed by automated means and data contained in or intended to be part of a non-automated systems is covered by this directive. So it's huge, and it's there to protect individuals, not companies, okay? So just individuals. And I'm just going to bring you through to a few basic concepts and introduce you to the big key changes that will be brought by this new piece of legislation. What you need to remember is that it is so strict, it is not at all easy, it will not be at all easy to process the personal data of EU citizens, that's for sure, okay? So personal data is defined in such a wide manner that it can cover any data that can be related directly or indirectly back to us. And it can also cover an IP address, something that's not necessarily directly what you would be considering as personal data. If you can relate it back indirectly to a person, it's covered. Processing, I don't think I'm going to go into all these definitions. What I want to really do is to tell you basically that you can only collect and process personal data if it's lawful to do so. And you do it in a very transparent manner. So you've always got to inform the users, the citizens, that you're actually processing personal data. And how can you process personal data? The main legal ground to process personal data is consent. And you need explicit consent of the citizens to process personal data. There are other grounds that can be used, but there are slightly more dangerous grounds because you'll need to justify them, of course. And these are to do with you have a contract between you and operator and a citizen, or on the basis of your legitimate interest. But that's a matter of interpretation, so it's more of a dangerous legal grounds. And then there's all sorts of principles to say that once you have got this data, you've got to keep it to a minimum, you've got to protect it against, make sure that it's secure, you've got to make sure it's accurate, you can only store it for a certain time, so it's hugely restrictive. And what do the new rules bring? Of course, greater harmonization. We have one block of rules that apply now in the EU, which make the things very, very, very much more. You have to comply, basically, with all this. The regulation is enormous. So it's very, very, very detailed. It's got an extended geographical scope, so it's intended also to cover non-EU suppliers, because there's so long as you start to sell or provide services to EU citizens, or if you monitor the behavior of EU citizens, you are caught by this legislation. So there's no concept of establishment. You don't even need an establishment in the EU to be caught, okay? There's a strengthened consent requirement. You really do need explicit, precise consent of the people when you're going to process their personal data. There's more obligations for the so-called controller, the company that determines the purpose of the processing. He's got to be very transparent, etc. There's lots and lots of new requirements. The data subjects has got a huge load of new requirements, including the right to be forgotten, the right to say, okay, I consented to give you the data, but in fact I'm changing my mind now, and please, stop processing my personal data. So that's, it's huge. So there's lots of new rights for the data subjects, and then the increased penalties, and this is just to frighten you, just to show you what's looming. Basically, you could be imposed either a fine of 20 million or up to 4% of your global annual turnover if you don't respect and you're in breach of these new rules on data protection. So this is very similar to the types of penalties that can be imposed in relation to competition breaches. So it's huge. And then there's reinforced powers given to the national data protection authorities, and there's a mechanism whereby there's a collaboration between the data protection authorities to make sure that one data protection authority is competent and is the interface with the company. So, yeah, data protection is becoming, it is a fundamental right already, but the actual, it's not sufficient in the eyes of the policymakers in the EU that it should be a fundamental right. It should be really declined in a very precise manner and enforced in a very strict manner, more so than for other types of fundamental rights, in my view. But anyway, that's a different topic for discussion. Okay? So I think Philippe, unless, wait a minute. Do you have any, sit back down, Philippe. Do you have any questions on this first introduction on the regulation of the different services and on this data protection aspect? I've killed you already. No, 2 questions. Yes, thank you.
I have one question about the possibility to enforce this precisely.
The data protection.
They cannot store information that the storage of information will be limited
to a certain time or years, I don't know. But how can the regulatory agency enforce that?
Yeah.
How can they know that they don't keep the information elsewhere?
Look, it's a very, very important and key question, of course, is always to do with how can these new laws actually be enforced in practice, and what are the mechanisms that are foreseen. Well, all I can tell you is that the main mechanism is the reinforcement of the powers of the data protection authorities. It's also the idea that if your business involves processing large amounts of personal data by automated means, you're normally supposed as a company to have a data protection officer in place. And that data protection officer is the interface between the company and the regulator. And the regulator is, of course, allowed and contacts the data protection officer with any questions and can ask, to document exactly all the processing that's carried on, to show them the procedures that are in place in relation, in particular, let's say, to the erasure of personal data. So there are mechanisms to, but of course it's going to be a question of which companies are they going to go after, but then it's a question of, will the consumer protection associations bring cases to the light, bring them to the attention of the data protection authorities. There's the press, there's a number of things that could alert a data protection authority of a potential problem. And it's obvious that the big companies will be more in the limelight than the smaller companies, and will definitely have to respect much more precisely, probably, these new rules, and those will be the prime suspects. But there are mechanisms, especially to do with the data protection officers, that need to be set up within companies. So now, in Europe at least, there's huge, departments dealing with these new obligations of data protection. In a minute, yeah.
So currently my team is analyzing if it's possible to regulate in which way the OTTs. And obviously we have to narrow the analysis because we don't have competencies, for instance, to regulate Uber transport or Uber Eats.
Transport services.
Yeah, because we are just telecom. So we kind of decide that we will kind of cover in the analysis OTTs that may be substitutes of telecom and audiovisual services, right?
Yeah.
And we're focusing on that. But then we have the problem that, and I don't know how you cope with this in the EU, and based on the current regulation that you have, even though it's very basic for the information society side of the story, is because we think about the Netflix, the Google, the Facebook, and they are big and usually they have offices in many countries. But there are a lot that they just have offices in some countries, and how do you sanction them if they don't have even an office, a physical office in your country? This is kind of the challenges we are finding in terms to move forward.
Yeah, we have obviously the same challenges, and in addition to that, what I've not explained to you is that in Europe we have this country of origin principle for the information society services, but also for the audiovisual sector. So it means that a television channel, a Netflix, or a WhatsApp type service, which are information society services, if they're established in one country, they're allowed to provide their services completely freely throughout the other countries, so long as they comply with the legislation of the country where they're established. Then, in the legislation, there are mechanisms that are built in to make sure that the authorities of the receiving country could, in case of severe breach of certain rules, block incoming services or make sure that the services comply with the legislation of the country of destination. But it doesn't work. It doesn't work for two reasons. First of all, because these operators often are not even established in Europe, okay? So there isn't an establishment. But in principle, the rule is, therefore, if there's no, this is a nitty-gritty question, but if there's no establishment, then normally there's no country of origin principle, so then normally each of the national member states is responsible and could act. But then, of course, the question is, how do you find them? You know, how do you make them comply? It's an enforcement problem, and that's to do with international conventions and things like that. We're going into private international law there. Okay, but it is a global problem, and it's a major problem. And then one of the other things I can tell you is that in the revision of the Audiovisual Media Services Directive, where we're trying to now regulate YouTube-type platforms, there is the idea that if YouTube has just a single toe in the EU, somehow, just a letterbox, boom, there's jurisdiction. Okay? So I think I'll stop now and...
To Aldo's question, I would answer, follow the money. You know, maybe that, I have no idea, this or this big OTT doesn't have headquarters in Mexico, but they probably have a billing relationship with businesses in Mexico who buy advertising. So from there, this is a very concrete channel. So I don't know whether the government cooperates with Mexican banks or what, but at least it's not like Facebook is not at all in Mexico. No, I'm sure they build tens of thousands of, then it's easy to catch them anyway, I think. Especially that you are a large market, you know. I sometimes travel to countries that have 500,000 people of population, and they tell me, what can we do about OTT? I say, the only way is to get together with your neighbors and try to create large communities. But Mexico, you're already 32 countries in a way, in one federation, so that you don't need to worry. Hello, transparency of algorithm. What I wanted to say about the GDPR, you can, in a way, it's a brand new piece of legislation. You can see it perhaps a bit like when Mexico changed the constitution to put all these articles on telecom, you know. Of course, that was very important. That included a lot of rules and so on. But that was not enough. After that, you know, IFETEL had to invent a lot of regulation and so on. And we are a bit at this stage, you know. Think of the GDPR as the equivalent of your telecom articles in the constitution. And now, on each of the topic, for example, the one I'm going to talk about now, there is a club of in every EU member state, in the 28 EU member state, you have a privacy commission, and they get together to become like a European regulator for privacy, if you like. It used to be called Working Party 29. That's what it used to be called. You will see it on some slides. It has changed name. It's called the European Data Protection Board, whatever. It's a new name. And they are the ones that are going to answer more specific questions. You know, some of them you will perhaps have when you listen to the rest of the presentation, or in the coming months, there will be new and they will be the one publishing guidance that will sort of shed some light on how this or this article should be interpreted. So I'll talk about another topic that is in the GDPR, which is about algorithm or automated processes. I'm saying algorithm to make it more clear. And let's be concrete and let's talk about telecom. I know very well a Turkish operator, Turkcell. It's a kind of a Telcel of Turkey. They've got 60 more % market share, so it's very much like Telcel. But it's a formidable company, very innovative, very high-tech, very into IT. And what they do, they sell to Turkish banks a credit scoring service. So you know what credit scoring is? When you go to your bank to buy a house, to buy a car, whatever, they sort of look at your profile and decide, yes, you know, this person is likely to refund me the price of the car, and therefore I will lend them money, okay? Now, usually, how banks do that, they look at, you bring your pay slip from IFETEL, they look at the wage, they look at whatever. What Turkcell does, they track, you know, the movement of the mobile phones. And they look at 600 parameters. When you send in the morning your first message, when the time you send your last message, where you spend your weekend, where you go on holiday, in which restaurant you eat, 600 parameters. And the kind of predictability, and for years they've been mixing that with the credit history, of a sample of clients, and credit history with bank. They've worked together with bank, and constantly they are updating that. You see, I'm not saying it's moral, ethical. I'm not going to that. I'm explaining, the concept. You get it, huh? And they achieve a much better predictability of the likelihood that the Turkish consumer is going to refund its credit than the banks themselves, okay? Now, that's a concrete example. And this is exactly, I'm going to talk about now what the GDPR says about this kind, not about the whole thing, but specifically about the use of algorithm in an example like that. So, what I've described is very much a perfect example of what is called profiling. So what you do is you predict, in this case, you predict whether I'm going to refund or not my credit, based on data from various sources. Here it's a bit of an extreme case, but and basically you infer conclusions on Philip based on what you have observed, on other individuals that you have in your sample, okay? So that's what profiling is about. And it can be used in many, many sectors. You know it very well. And what the GDPR says is that citizens, data subject citizens, have the right to ask for automated processes, algorithm if you prefer, affecting them to be not fully automated. They have got the right to ask for human intervention. They have the right to go and see the bank and explain why they disagree with the conclusion that the algorithm has reached, and they have the right to contest the decision. Ça va? Alors, what I find very... this remote... Yeah. Now, this is GDPR. This is about privacy. Between us, it's going to be exactly the same problem in competition law. Companies, for setting their prices, will use algorithm, will use artificial intelligence to track the prices of competitors, online, automatically. And adjust, that already, they do that already. So if you're a competition authority, you will be exactly like the privacy regulators, you will need to understand how the algorithm works. Because, for example, let's take competition law. If the algorithm of, let's say there is a market, a duopoly, a duopoly on beer, for example, whatever you like, a duopoly. One company says that whatever the other company sets as a price, I match that price. They raise the price, I raise the price. They lower the price, they lower the price, okay? And the other company is an algorithm that raises the price automatically by, 2% a month. You can imagine? So this is typically the kind of cases that competition authorities will have to look into. And they will have to decide whether there is an intention be there or it's just a normal reaction. Well, so in financial markets, same thing. You can create all sort of... Well, so back to privacy, but it's nothing to do with privacy. It will be for all economic regulators across the board. There will be a need for companies to develop more understandable algorithms, not to have algorithms which are purely black boxes, and where the reason why I've been turned out for a job, the reason why I've been turned out for a credit, I will be, complaining, and the only answer I will get is the computer said you won't get your credit. Why? On the basis of which criteria, And I'm not at all the right guy to speak to you about that. You need to invite, I'm sure there are many people in this country, who know about these things that I encourage you to invite them. But there is a new movement among technologists in artificial intelligence to develop explainable artificial intelligence. For example, the DARPA, the Department of the State, the Department of Defense in the state that invented the internet, is having research program on exactly doing that, making algorithm more transparent. Also, when we say artificial intelligence, that it's a broad family of different technologies. that you see on the screen. And you see that some technologies are better than others, are achieving predictability, which is what we want artificial intelligence to do. But they are not so good at being transparent, you know. Well, if you take something like Bayesian belief, I've seen examples. If you know the field, if you're a doctor, you can understand, you know, how the algorithm based on Bayesian belief works, because it's if you're an economist and it's about, you know, predicting, you know, credit scoring, it is pretty easy to understand. Okay, so there is a whole field there of research to basically push, you know, many of these technologies into the top right corner, meaning more predictability, of course, that's the whole point, but also improving the explainability. Because if we don't do that, citizens will basically, it will fire back. You know, citizens, politicians, and so on will slow down the move to a greater digitization. Alors, since you've got presidential elections soon in Mexico, I thought I would quote a recently elected president, and not the worst politician we've got at the moment in Europe. And he recently launched the French AI strategy. And one of these points was exactly that. He said we need to make algorithm transparent. We need to track any bias. We shouldn't, you know, give to technologists and algorithms the monopoly of the decision. We need to make it, you know, we need to involve humans to basically the sort of democratic decision that government makes on the criteria to get to a public university, the criteria to join the civil service, the whatever. These artificial intelligence algorithms will be involved in those decisions. That's the right thing, you know, to make them more efficient, more non-discriminatory, more what you want. But these should not be black boxes. Otherwise, citizens won't accept it. Voilà.
So our next element is we thought we'd talk to you a little bit about fake news and what's going on in Europe in relation to fake news, because they also rely on, you know, data being sent massively over networks to obviously, you know, influence decisions, very important decisions like elections, as we all know. And I think in all regions of the world, fake news is a topic that's being debated, and what should you do in relation to fake news. So what I'm going to do is just to bring to you a few of the solutions that have been proposed in Europe, and of course the very, very difficult balance between freedom of expression and censorship, because if you move into regulating somehow fake news, you could of course go into also censorship. So I think it's a key issue as well, and it's a good example of maybe what people are doing to capture these problematic areas that are to do with the data economy, and especially in relation to really key public policy debates that we can have. So the European Commission, so our government here, it doesn't represent, this is just the European Commission, so it's not the EU institutions, has come up with a communication, which basically doesn't mean much in terms of legal obligations, but it's the idea that the EU should do something, should react to this fake news phenomenon. And the EU doesn't really want to talk about fake news. It wants to talk about online disinformation campaigns. And it's to do here with, we're talking about false or misleading information that's created, presented, or disseminated for economic gain, or intentionally to deceive the public and may cause public harm. So it's not to do with an individual piece of news item that could be false or fake, okay, is to do with massive dissemination of information over the networks to influence the public how do you call it, public perception or elections. And so what's interesting is that the EU has decided, the Commission has decided not to go along the path of adopting hardcore legislation. It wants to promote the idea of a code of conduct that should be adopted by all the potential spreaders, if you want, of operators that are involved in the dissemination of this fake news. I'll call it fake news because it's easier than calling it the official term. So this EU-wide code of conduct will have to be agreed by Facebook, Google, Twitter, all the big platforms in general. And the idea is to have a code of conduct agreed by July of this year. And that code of conduct should, in fact, also be based very much on the idea of transparency, the idea that sponsored content and political advertising that's disseminated over these networks, these platforms, should be made transparent. It's the idea that fake accounts should be closed down as quickly as possible by the operators. So we're seeing, you see, there's a sort of idea that they should actively make sure somehow that this fake information is not disseminated, because it's often disseminated through automated bots and fake accounts. They should establish tools to report this fake news. There should be safeguards by design, including through notably artificial intelligence. Also, access to data. They should make the data on these networks available they're talking about fact checkers, because these would be the big companies would also have to set up a network of fact checkers that would be paid by them, I suppose, or by the governments. To try to identify what could potentially be false information. And all these people should have access to the data produced by the platforms. And also they're talking about academia, to understand, again, the algorithms that are behind these, the use of fake news. So there's lots and lots of different measures that the European Commission is proposing, including giving money to support research. There's many things like fostering quality journalism, improving media literacy. That's an area that often goes hand in hand with all these new topics, especially when you're talking about protecting the populations against certain phenomena. And that's an area as well where regulators or national authorities or governments beginning to have a clearer role to play in relation to media literacy, to make sure that the populations themselves understand potentially what could be fake information and not to rely too much on certain sources of information. There's the idea as well that platforms should have some sort of a rating system so that you can trust what type of, if certain information is a trusted source or not of information. So the thing to remember is that at the EU level at the moment, the European Commission is relying on this idea of this, European-wide code of practice that will be developed by the operators. They themselves should self-regulate themselves. If and only if that doesn't function, could the European Commission and the European institutions decide to adopt binding regulation? Now, that's what's happening at the EU level. And in fact, when you look at what's happening at national level, it's a little bit of a different thing. We have the beginning of laws in a number of countries. We have a law that's adopted already in Germany that has a wider scope of application, but also covers fake news. whereby platforms would have to remove very quickly fake news and filter out themselves fake news. And if they don't, they could be faced with big fines. And then there's a number of countries that are proposing laws to try to tackle fake news. And one of the cases is say, for instance, France. Our friend Emmanuel Macron was one of his, because he was a victim as well of disinformation campaigns during the election campaign. And his idea is to also adopt a law, but mainly to protect against online disinformation campaigns that take place during election campaigns. What's interesting here again is that there can be a rapid court procedure that could be introduced with injunctions that could be issued, active injunctions so the platforms take down and act very quickly. But also there's an increased role for the media regulator, the CSA, to take action in case of fake news, but then more on television channels. Okay, so fake news has been tackled there, and then some countries where it was pretty surprising, I would say, like Sweden, which is usually a country which relies heavily on freedom of expression and non-intervention. There's the idea that there should be a special commission set up within the government to try to filter out somehow fake news. Same thing in the UK. So, there's a number of, and that's what's interesting as well, is that when you maybe, the EU at the moment has a soft law approach, but the member states are going into, quite local new laws that would be adopted or try to tackle it from a local perspective, which of course, will probably be difficult to probably an EU approach would be better, but there again the big problem is freedom of expression. So we have not got a solution in Europe about that at the moment, but what we have got certainly is to try to make the platforms responsible more to do things themselves and to make information available in a more transparent manner, to actively remove fake accounts and to trace through artificial intelligence as well what's going on. Okay. Oh yeah, what I wanted to say as well, perhaps from a slightly more macro point of view, is that we are seeing, I think, a trend in Europe at the moment towards giving much more responsibility, placing much more responsibility and liability on platforms. And we're seeing that because, in fact, we come from a situation where, just like the telecom operators, the ISPs, there's a principle that these operators are not responsible for third-party illegal content. They're just providers of technical facilities, and they're not responsible. That's the basic principle under EU legislation enshrined in the e-commerce directive, for your information. Well, that principle is beginning to erode in certain areas, and one of the first area of erosion comes with the fact that the audiovisual platforms will be included in the e-commerce directive, with the idea that these platforms should take measures to make sure that minors are protected. So they have even though they don't have an editorial responsibility, you see that they have to do more and more things. Okay? In the area of copyright, it's the same. We have a new piece of legislation that says that platforms, YouTube-type platforms, have to clear copyright when user-generated content protected by copyright is uploaded on the platforms. They're communicating they're communicating works to the public subject to copyright. And so normally the principle under this new piece of legislation that will be adopted is that they're responsible to pay copyright. So they can't hide behind the safe harbor that they used to have. Okay, so the trend we see in Europe is to make platforms more and more responsible. And I think that's the main message I want to put forward.
Yet another major subject when talking about the regulation of the data economy is security. And I'll start by a telecom example. A couple of years ago, 3 years ago now, TalkTalk is an MVNO, and also it's also active on the fixed broadband market in the UK. And 3 years ago, there was a hacking of the IT system, and the personal data of 150,000 customers was stolen. Sometimes it was just name, address, sometimes it was name, address, and the bank account. They got a fine, from the privacy authority in the UK, not much, not even £500,000, for a telecom operator, that's not much. But the real cost for this company, for TalkTalk, is that the story that they had been hacked became known, and that led to the loss of almost 100,000 customers. So what I want to show you with this story is that, of course, cyber security is a very complex subject. Companies need to employ clever people. I will talk to you about in a minute about standards and so on. But from a public policy point of view, the most powerful tool that government can put in place to improve cybersecurity is to force organizations to reveal that they've been hacked. And the consequences are so damaging that this government, you think if I do that, they're going to do all these very complicated things, I don't understand everything, but they're going to do the right thing so that it doesn't happen, And in the case of TalkTalk, the reason why the hacking happened is that they had been really negligent. They had not installed the latest upgrades of the software. So it's a real stupid thing, So from the point of view of at principle level, the regulation of security is much simpler than the complex stuff we talk about when dealing with with privacy. So that's the message. Now, the GDPR, we continue to talk about the GDPR throughout the presentation. The GDPR includes new obligation for data processor, data controller. What is it? For example, Cullen, our company, pays to Michel and myself a wage. So we are the data subject. We have a knowledge of we have a wage. Cullen is the data controller, and there is a third party which is calculated how much taxes and so on. That's the data processor. And the GDPR imposes obligation on both the data controller, Cullen in my example, and the data processor, the company calculating our wage. Okay, and you see, it's I won't go into the detail, but it's all about as soon as you find out that there has been a data breach, you cannot sit on it and think, hopefully nobody will notice, I'm going to fix it and we'll be all right. No, it's a legal obligation to reveal it. Okay. Alors, in a nutshell, if the data breach is minor, it is little, you only notify the data supervisory authority, the privacy commission if you prefer. If it's a serious data breach with potential damaging consequences for the citizens, for the data subject, you need to inform the data subject. And this is when you start, losing clients en masse because it's very bad advertising, okay? We also have a special regime of revealing data breaches for specific organization, which, I'll be concrete, I'll show them what they are. It's essentially operators of utilities. So you look at the list, energy companies, transport companies, banking, financial infrastructures, health sector, drinking water, internet exchange points. So all the things, all the organization that a modern economy needs to run every day. But also, and that's very interesting for our conversation today on data economy, look on the right side of the chart, you see online marketplaces, Amazon. You see search engine, Google search. You see cloud computing, you know, all the Azure from Microsoft are caught, you know, by this, just like the essential infrastructures of your country, just like your electricity companies, your railway companies. The telecom have a similar regime, but I won't bore you with that. It's a different measure, but they are subject to a similar regime. Alors, a word on our cybersecurity agency. It's called ENISA, based in Greece. You know, I don't know whether you do the same in the Federation of Mexico. Each state try to attract federal agencies. No, you're more clever, you put them all in Mexico. That's clever, you know, we're not that clever. Each time we invent, you know, a new agency, there is intense lobbying, and you got financial services. I need, you know, medical, you know, the equivalent of the FDA, you know. So the Greek got ENISA, the cybersecurity. And it has been around for years, but we have a new piece of regulation which was adopted last autumn, which is now in the legislative process. And I've got many slides, but I'll rather tell you the story. It says, of course, the funding of this agency is going to be reinforced, that they will be able to recruit more people, but essentially, they will focus more on standards and certification. What is the problem with standards? You may say, if you are more informed than me about security, you may say, Philippine, there are ISO, you know, international standards on security. The problem is that today, when you go to Europe, there are about half of the countries of Europe that do not recognize those ISO standards for security. They just think they are not well written, irrelevant anyway. They don't consider them, okay? So if you want to ship, for example, an IoT product which you believe is secure from Germany to France, maybe one of the two countries will start redoing all a national certification based on their local standards, you know? So there will be a big push not to create European standards that are different from the rest of the world, but to scrutinize ISO, so world standard, global standard, see whether they are fit for the job or not, if not, amend them, and turn them into European standards that vendors, you know, IT vendors can use to ship product, to install IT solutions throughout the European Union. You get the idea? So a big job on defining standards, okay? And then you know what's coming next. Once you have defined standards, what do you need? You need laboratories to certify that your product, your IT solution meets the standard. Alors, does it mean that, you know, if you read a bit about IoTs, I think that by 2020, we expect 30 IoT in every European family. That's next 2 years. And if you look at prediction for in 10 years, we'll just be surrounded by sensors. Now, does it mean that the Europeans who have a bad reputation for over-regulation, you know, have found yet another thing to over-regulate? We are going to, every gadget will have to be certified? No, no, no. There will be standards, but the certification will be mandatory only for essential devices. You know, when self-driving cars will be on the market, you know, you can be pretty sure that it will be one of the application, of course, that will have to be certified, you know. But if you buy more simple gadget with, you know, less of possible damaging consequences, it will be up to the manufacturer to either go for certification and use that as a marketing tool. You can buy this cheap camera to do the surveillance of your garden. It's certified, therefore, you know, it cannot be used for hacking and so on. Or you can go the simpler route of saying, no, I want a cheap product, I'm not going to waste $2 certifying, okay? Well, this is essentially what we are doing And for those who are fun, you can read my slides.
So the next topic I wanted to share with you is this concept of data portability. Now, I don't know if any of you are familiar with the notion of portability. Yeah? You know what portability means? It's to port something, to carry something. And the notion first appeared in relation to number portability. So it's the idea that you could take your telephone number, and use it with another network operator. So number portability. And now this concept, if you want, of portability, I think is a growing concept in the EU. And of course, we're talking about data portability, but it's a little bit wider than data portability. So I'm just going to explain to you what it means, so that you can see if there is a similar concept that could arise in Mexico. So we already have now, as we speak, a new data portability right, and that's again enshrined in our General Data Protection Regulation. And it basically means that you are, so here in the shaded is me and you, okay? We're using Facebook, but we could be using any other platform. We've uploaded a load of personal data onto this platform, and it's the idea, which is logical when you think about the General Data Protection Directive, you should be able to have access to be able to retrieve all that data, okay? So that you have a right to receive the personal data in a it goes further, in a structured and commonly used and machine-readable format. And it goes further. It also allows you as a citizen to ask the provider, so let's say, take here Facebook, to send all that data across to another platform, okay? So when technically feasible, Facebook should transmit all this personal data from him to another company. And so, of course, the objective of this new right is to reinforce your right to personal data, but it's also to make sure, potentially, that other platforms could emerge and that Facebook doesn't have a complete monopoly on this personal data. You see? You see the concept? Okay. So how all this will be used, will be enforced in practice, that we shall see. But again, the European Data Protection Board will probably come up with a number, and it already has, Article 29 Working Party has already come up with a number of guidelines about how this should be implemented in practice. But it's going to become a real right, the right to data portability for personal data. Now, it goes a little bit further than that. And I want to share with you this concept of portability, how it's been declined in various pieces of regulation that are either adopted, like the General Data Protection Regulation, or in the process of adoption. And we have another regulation that's just been adopted that allows you as well, it's a regulation on content portability. And this is the idea, so if you subscribe to a service, a content service like Spotify or like Netflix, and or just let's say a pay TV channel, okay? If that content service can be ported in one country, so in your country, if you can see that content both, let's say, on your computer, on your television, and also potentially on your mobile phone, it's portable in your country, okay? You should be able to go to another country and see that content as well, okay? But this is a piece of regulation that could be only potentially applicable maybe in the EU. It was needed in the EU because there was all this content was being geo-blocked very much, okay? But it's only the idea that when you go temporarily into another country, you should have access to it. It doesn't mean that me in Belgium should be able to access and subscribe to a service in the UK. Content is usually geo-blocked and only available to UK residents, okay? But it just allows me, if I've got my subscription in Belgium, to go to the UK and to benefit from that subscription. So this concept of portability starts with portability of numbers, okay? Portability of personal data, portability of your content that you've subscribed to, you go elsewhere with it. And then we've also got more legislation in the pipeline. I'm not going to bore you too much with it, but here it's the idea that consumers should be allowed to retrieve their non-personal data. So, for instance, if I've uploaded onto a platform onto photos that are not my photos, they're not, you know, it's not personal data, it's a photo of somebody else, it's music, it's a film, it's whatever, I should be able to retrieve as well that content. And that's because of new consumer protection legislation that's in the pipeline. So this concept of portability is a growing concept, and it's really intended initially to give citizens and consumers more empowerment over their data, over their content in general, okay? But it's also intended, at least for two of the initiatives, to make sure that data is not locked into certain platforms and that there should be a transfer of all this data across to other platforms potentially, so that there's more competition in the market for platforms. Okay? I don't know if it's something that you've come across in Mexico or not, but maybe it'll come in a few years. But at least you know now that we'll have legislation, and by then we'll be able to tell you if it's working, if it's not working, what the problems are with that. Okay? What? Tu veux que je continue?
Non, attends, t'as un slide. Je vais dire quelque chose.
Quel slide? Non, mais ça, j'avais pas lu. Ah, celui-là, tu veux que je dise?
Non, mais on the cloud thing, for telecom regulators, not just IFETEL, next week I'm going to a meeting with BEREC, the European regulators, where we are going to spend a whole day on data regulation, with a view of what? Of expanding activities. So in the field of data portability, I give you a perfect example of a potential job for a telecom regulator. One of the initiatives that Michel alluded to is cloud portability. You know, Cullen, if you go to Cullen website, all the data on Amazon. Seems to be working fine. But if our IT department suddenly decided that we would be better off being on Microsoft Azure, which is the other big cloud provider, or another one, there is nothing like number portability for mobile numbers, you know. It is, you know, so there is a process at the moment in Brussels to create rights for citizens, but also for corporations in this case, to smoothly move their data from one cloud to another. Of course, this is big business, there will be disputes, and one question that is open is whether the dispute resolution should be made in front of courts, you know, Tribunal of Commerce, or whether they should be a regulator, an ex-ante regulator, setting more precise rules. At the moment, the plan, since I see a few people interested, thinking, could be a good business, the plan in Brussels is to give 1 year to cloud vendors and to cloud users, companies buying cloud services, to agree on a code of conduct, you know? If I want to port my data, that's how it should be done. Now, I won't bore you with details, but past experience with self-regulation and cloud have been a disaster. So nobody is very optimistic that by the end of the year they will achieve something, okay? So, in my opinion, in my humble opinion, there will be hard regulation in the coming years, and there will be a question of who should be enforcing this new regulation. Again, we can leave it to the courts. I'm not always obsessed by regulation, a little bit, but or it could be a great job for telecom regulators, I think, you know, because it's very close to the, like it, you know. Alors, I will talk about yet a new subject, which is very much an emerging subject. So, a lot of these things are my fantasies, more than actually, you know, real directive that I can point to, okay? If you remember my funny introduction with the vacuum cleaner and the royal wedding and so on, we see that data is the new oil. We see that data is the basis for the creation of not just a lot of economic activities, but for improving healthcare, for everything you look at, potentially access to data is essential. And the kind of comments that you hear, you know, sipping beers in Brussels and discussing that is that data are non-rival goods, you know. I've got data, but if you use them as well, I still have my data. You know, with oil, if you take my oil barrel, I don't have it. With data, we can both have the data, and, you know, I will not lose it. Often, the collection of data is a byproduct of offering another service. You know, Facebook collects data on the back of having social network. You know, it doesn't cost them much more to collect their data, you know. Some data are non-replicable. So they're a bit like, some are, but some data are not replicable. For example, car manufacturers will increasingly collect detailed information on how each piece of the car performs, so that in the future they can sell you like a financial service, an insurance service, on how long your car will work without repair. Only the car manufacturer that sells you the car knows that, you know. Google cannot know how this and this piece of your car is working. This is typically an information that is not replicable. There are plenty of information that are replicable. Huh? AI it's probably a general purpose technology, just like electricity, you know, just like the internet. So it means it's not a technology that is for the banking sector or for the airlines. It's a technology that basically serves absolutely all the sectors of the economy. Okay? Alors, why do I say that? It's because it means it's very important, you know, and if we do a bit crazy things, you know, like daring things in terms of access, it will benefit the whole economy. You know? I'm not pleading here, I'm repeating argument I've heard. So if you know, look at all that, you say, it's probably worse for us if Etel spending 15 minutes discussing about access to data, you know, because, you know, data is important, and each of these bullet points, which are, of course, are right, the subject of intense debates. If you are a big data holder like Google, you know, you see that and you start, you know, saying, my data are replicable, and you know, it's a rival good because I have whatever, you know. So what I'm going to talk about is very much, I'm not an anarchist. I'm well aware, and I'll show it later, that data are subject to privacy requirements, security requirement, intellectual property requirement, and so on and so on and so on. But if you take an old subject, which Rebecca knows well, is a former COFECE employee, the tension between competition law, antitrust law, and intellectual property. You know, normally antitrust law is we want competition. Now, if you give to somebody a patent, basically you give them a monopoly to produce that stuff for a number of years, you know. At the same time, if you have a patent for 5G, for the 5G expert here, it's deemed to be an essential patent. You have by law to license it to others against a remuneration. So if you take this simple classic example, old example of competition law and intellectual property, you see that it's not black and white. Sometimes we diminish a bit the importance of competition law to give a monopoly to the innovators so that they continue to innovate. And when the innovation is essential to society, like 5G, we tell innovators, okay, you've got a patent, but you've got to license the others. You see? And my idea is that this debate is going to come to access to data. It's not about denying all the established regulation on privacy, intellectual property, competition law. It's about finding a new balance between something which is increasingly recognized as essential to the economy, to society, and these all the rights. Alors, it's very difficult to talk about all this in simple words because the question of access to data, as Michel has started to explain, is super multidimensional. And I will explore this concept of multidimensional in essentially along two dimensions. The first few slides will be on who is exchanging the data. So I will focus on the players, if you like, rather than the nature of the data. And then I will look at the specific rights, intellectual property, competition law, and so on. Okay? So if we start with the first dimension, there are essentially three scenarios. Government to business, business to business, and business to government, okay? So on the right side is who is the data holder, and on the right side is to whom the data is flowing, okay? So we start conservative, government to business. If you know, this is basically the concept of open data. And I'm sure you have it in one form. I mean, certainly, although beautiful statistics is the perfect example, of a fantastic, and congratulations to IFETEL, because I think you're leading on that front. It's a perfect example of an open data policy. So IFETEL, a government agency, is sitting on a gold mine of data. In the good old days, in every country of the world, the culture was, this is data for bureaucrats. There is no reason we should share it. Today, the culture of open data is to make the data available. Why? Because there are clever people out there in the private sector, in universities, that might do something useful with it. That's the idea. Alors, Obama launched that in the US. When I was preparing the presentation, I discovered the Australian, everybody does it. I won't bore you with what the Europeans do. We have it as well. So the first part is easy. When data is held by government, there is a big culture around the world to say the government needs to share. Why? Because there are clever people that might do something with it. Now, if you say, Philippe, we like your idea, surely if it's good idea for IFETEL to share their data, probably a good idea to look at whether it wouldn't be a good idea for the private sector to share a bit the data. So look at the B2B. So, alors, we had a big consultation on this topic in the EU, and the conclusion at this moment, I'm not saying that this is like for a cloud, the portability of data from one cloud to another, cloud provider to another, this is the final response. But at the moment, if you say, what is the score in Brussels? The score in Brussels is, we're not going to regulate, the flow of data between businesses, but the European Commission has issued guidance, okay? And if you look at the guide, it's brand new. You see, we're bringing you fresh information from not even 2 months ago. And essentially, what we've got there is, for people who like 5G and IoTs, it is about principle to ensure a fair markets for IoTs, with respect to data that are created by the object. So when you, in the future, your house is full of IoTs, like the vacuum cleaner, you remember in my introduction, how about the fair condition for trading those data which are generated by IoTs, okay? And we have I'll show you a brief summary, not to be too long. And I draw your attention to there are things which are fine, you know, boring, but I draw your attention to the red stars, you know. And here we're talking about the definition describing what are fair contractual position. Of course, if you say, I don't know, Michel, you correct me here, but if the European Commission says, these are fair contractual condition, if you don't do it, in my opinion, it means that they are not so fair, perhaps bordering on the unfair. You see what I mean? Even if you simply issue guidance with these are the fair contractual conditions, basically you define implicitly what would be unfair, in my opinion. Huh? So let's look at that. Share value creation. Contracts should recognize that where data is generated as a byproduct of using the service, think of my vacuum cleaner, several parties have contributed to create such data. You know, like, you see, so the data shouldn't be, the value of the data shouldn't just be for the vacuum cleaner, they should be value for the others, for example, the consumer that put it in his house in this case. Look at the last line now. Minimize data lock-in. Again, think of the vacuum cleaner. Those sort of companies should allow data portability as much as possible. Okay? So this is not hardcore regulation. This is, I'm reporting here about really the beginning of a process. But you see the European Commission publishing guidance with what they regard as the right behavior. You know? And in my opinion, it smells like a non-things probably in the future. You know, well, that's me. Michel don't have to. Let's look now. You remember government to business, business to business. Let's look at business to government. What? You know, this is. Well. Alors, when you think of it, business to government is an old story. If I go back to my friend Aldo is requesting from all the telecom operators in Mexico statistics. That's exactly, you know, perfect illustration of a B to government, you know, business to government. And there as well, the European Commission has issued guidance, you know, should be proportional, that's fine. Contract should acknowledge, alors, this is interesting, because sometimes, not if Etel doesn't pay Telcel to have statistics, Aldo is not that generous, but in some cases, there will be financial transactions, because whatever. But what the Commission says is the contract should acknowledge the public interest characteristic of the information. In other words, it's for the public interest, probably the financial condition and the rest should be adjusted to reflect that. Ah oui, that's a good one. Like the last star, mitigate limitation of private sector data. You know that one of the key conditions for using big data, machine learning and so on, is to have good quality data. If you have the best Google algorithm and the brightest engineer, but the data that you feed the algorithm are of poor quality, you're not going to predict very well. So there are even conditions about, you know, companies having to help government sort of clean the data. Alors, back to France, you know, because the reason why I'm quoting France is because I read French. I don't read much other languages. So, and also they have issued a brand new artificial intelligence strategy that has been created by a guy who won the Nobel Prize for mathematics. So at least it's a clever guy that knows what he's talking about. And that's something. Hello. What time is it? do you still have a few minutes? I will now explore 5. Okay, so I will speed up a bit. So we are on data sharing. We have explored, and you see that whether it's the government sharing to the private sector sharing to the government, or business to business, we're talking about completely different environment in terms of what it is reasonable to request, you know. In the last example that I gave, business to government, we talked about all the statistics, but let's take another one. In the future, when cars are much more connected than they are today and full of sensors, when the car driving will be able to feel that the road at a certain place my son, for example, a couple of months ago, took his car and at 2 o'clock in the morning slid it on ice and ended up on the top roof, you know. Well, voilà. It's not a connected car. But when, you know, let's think of this exact situation in 10 years, you know. It should be, we all agree, mandatory for the car manufacturer to signal that there is ice in this place on the road at that time. And for public to communicate it to public authorities that will inform all the cars that they have to slow down at that place, you see? So now, let's look at the other dimension, forgetting about whether it's government or public sectors. What should we do to improve the flow of data? Alors Macron, he says we should create something like, I didn't say Airbnb, but I'm translating for you from French into plain English, from official French into plain English. We should have, you know, a few years ago, if you were lucky to have an apartment that was empty for a few days, you would just let it sit there, you know, which is, from an economic point of view, a loss of welfare because somebody would have been happy to use your apartment for a few days. So what Airbnb enables you to do is to do a matching between somebody looking for a flat and somebody who is happy to do a bit of money by not being in his flat for a few days. So what we need to do, says Macron, and says that much nicer than me, is that we need an Airbnb to enable people who have data and people who might need the data to meet. Okay? Anyway, you can read that another time. So competition law. When we will tell, you know, one of the problems that will need to be solved if we want to boost data sharing between private companies, between businesses, will be not to encourage potential collusion between these companies. You know, if you say you're going to share all your sales figures between businesses, you know, that's, I'm sure Kofese would quickly jump on that. Now, I'm giving you, but it doesn't mean it's impossible. For example, there is a Spanish, back home, there is a European Court of Justice about a Spanish case which is about Spanish bank sharing blacklist of bad debtors, people who do not pay back their loan, if you like, okay? And there was a case 10 years ago, and the court said, you know, yeah, that's just to say they shouldn't speak, that you know. And the court said, you know, I looked at your case, and it's true, cartel, concerted practices, you know, are prohibited. Each firm should develop its own strategy without having a privileged access to confidential information from their competitors. However, where the market is not highly concentrated, where the sharing of the blacklist does not allow a bank to recognize what is the bank, so in other words, each bank has access to the bad payers of the other bank, but they don't know for which bank the payer belongs to. You see what I mean? Why that? Why do you think the court imposed that condition? You get it? The second one? So Spanish banks can have access to all the list of the other banks, but they cannot know that list number 3 is Santander. That's because if you know who the bet payers are, you can do reverse engineering and find out what their commercial strategy is. You see what I mean? You can assess the level of risk they take, things like that. Well, and then it should be non-discriminatory. So I'm just showing you this case to say that it's not like I'm coming up with a new issue. Businesses have been exchanging information, and competition authority, or here the court, have been looking at how it's possible to reconciliate, antitrust law, which shouldn't be denied with. Anyway, look, you can read the rest. On personal data, we have GDPR, we have privacy. What Michel explained with data portability is that if I want to switch from Facebook to Google+, I don't have to ring code, myself, 10 years of holidays on Facebook and so on. I can ask for data portability, okay? What the GDPR doesn't create as a right is a permanent access to my Facebook data. So in other words, I cannot continue to be on Facebook and press a button whereby Google Plus has access to all my updates. Okay, that we don't have that. Wouldn't be a bad idea, but we don't have it. So we need to work on concepts like Telefonica, Telecom Italia have worked with the MIT a few years ago to work on something that they call the personal data store. So you put your data in a vault, if you like in a bank, and then you decide on a need-to-know basis who has access to your data. You see? So that's one. An example, a European example in the field of financial services. We have a new directive, it's called Payment Service Directive number 2, whereby if I have several bank accounts with different banks, today I need to log in, with a special password for bank number 1, then I do the same for bank number 2, then for bank number 3. It's now mandatory for a European bank to give access, with my consent of course, but to give access to my various bank accounts to IT solution that enables me with my smartphone or my PC to see all my bank accounts on one screen, which is, again, a good example of sharing of data. Yeah, that's it. That I've mentioned it. I'm speeding up not to waste your time. There are, of course, specific cases. It's just to illustrate, and I'll stop soon, Juan Carlos. Another scenario, which is probably less contentious, but I'm showing it to you to illustrate the variety of cases. And then when it comes to, if somebody was not able to be here today and ask you, in Europe, do they mandate access to data? You see that it's not the right question, because there are so many cases. And one of the cases I want to discuss here is the sharing of data in the context of a broader commercial relationship, When Lufthansa buys a plane from Boeing, from Airbus, as they did recently, they chose engine from a company in France, CFM. Now, you know that airlines and aircraft manufacturers are monitoring in real time the functioning of these engines, And sometimes they detect something that is a little bit wrong, and when the plane lands, the engineer is already there fixing it. But it's clear that in this kind of scenario, the flow of B2B data, it's part of a broader commercial relationship and does not require probably any regulatory intervention. I'm almost done. The exchange of data between businesses is now one of the big trade questions. Trade question. Usually trade question is Trump, complaining that the Mexicans are not buying enough whatever, goods. Californian wine or whatever. But a new topic, which is very big, is data protectionism. You know, I go to many countries that say data cannot leave the country. Why? Because it's the new oil, because security, because whatever. You know? And so it becomes a real obstacle, just like protectionism, what these most economists believe, is not good for the global economy, the growth of the global economy. It's become a disease now. This data protectionism that prevents even non-personal data. I'm not talking about your personal data to flow freely to North Korea. I'm talking about non-personal data which countries lack. So all the Arab countries typically, but not just them, many of them. Voila, but I think I'll stop there so that we stay on time. So this is, in my opinion, delivering this last bit of the presentation in front of telecom regulators, a potential subject for IFETEL. You are not going to become the privacy regulator. You are not become, you know, the regulation of a financial services algorithm. The financial authority will do it. But you see that around a number of questions that Michel and I presented, but particularly, in my opinion, this question of access to data, which I don't want to compare too much to access to local loop unbundling. That would be wrong. This would be a very dangerous comparison. But it's still about what are the economic conditions, you know, for access to a precious resource. It's not copper in this case, but it's something which is vital for the development of the economy. So I hope this provides you with food for thought before the food that you're going to get now. Thank you.
Muchísimas gracias a Philippe y a Michel. Damos unos minutos para un par de preguntas más, si alguien tiene alguna pregunta o comentario. Pues bueno, llegó la hora de comer. It's time for lunch, and we have a short day today. Yeah. We want to thank very much Philippe and Michel for a very rich discussion. You did respect the motto that inspires Colin International. You did present in a simple way what's really a very complex and difficult issue and future-looking issue. Thank you so much, both of you. And this is your home. We'll welcome you once again very soon. Muchas gracias.
Thank you, Juan Carlos. Was the best compliment we could get. Regulation made simple. I'm not sure we fully succeeded, but we tried.